All right, guys, you are locked on Falcons. I'm your host, Aaron Freeman, and today we are doing our in-depth scouting report of the Falcons 2021 second round pick out of UCF in safety, Richie Grant.
You are Locked On Falcons, your daily Atlanta Falcons podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
So guys, you know me, I'm Aaron Freeman, been covering the Falcons for many years, formerly at FalcFans.com, RIP, still going strong, however, on Twitter at FalcFans, and of course, the host of this illustrious Locked On Falcons podcast, your daily Atlanta Falcons podcast, right here on the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. And today's episode of Locked On Falcons is brought to you by Built Bar. Go to BuiltBar.com, use the promo code LOCKED15, and you'll get 15% off your next order. So today's episode is going to be our second scouting report of the post-2021 draft era. Already did one on Kyle Pitts. We're doing another one on Richie Grant. And we'll be going deep into his strengths, his weaknesses, his floor, his ceiling, his eye level, use some NFL comparisons for what he can and should and will be here in Atlanta, hopefully over the next, 7 to 10 years. We'll see. And, before we get into that, I do want to sort of give you a heads up that I'll be using a little bit of a shorthand throughout today's episode, comparing Richie Grant to the Falcons' two previous free safeties that they've had over the last 5 years in Ricardo Allen and Damontae Kazee. And I'm not going to get too deep into what I thought of Allen and Kazee, but basically Kazee was more of a playmaker given his speed, his range, but was very inconsistent. You can kind of think of him using a baseball analogy as a guy that would hit the home runs, but also strike out a bunch. Allen was a little bit more consistent down to down, but didn't make a ton of plays. So from the baseball analogy, he's more the guy that consistently hits singles and doubles, gets on base consistently, but rarely hits for power, rarely drives in those runs. Allen had more of that neck up ability in terms of his awareness, while Kazee was probably a little bit better from the neck down in terms of his speed and athleticism, the traits that you're looking for in a free safety. And so as we continue today, later in this episode, when we talk a little bit more about where Grant is as a player, and we'll talk a little bit about where he is on the spectrum, on one end of the spectrum, looking at some of those guys' traits with Ricardo Allen, and the other end of the spectrum being Damontae Kazee. And so I'll be using that somewhat as a shorthand. Because I know a lot of you guys are very familiar with Ricardo Allen, Damontae Kazee's game, because you've been watching those guys for the better part of 5 years. And it's not to sit here and say that every safety fits on that spectrum. It's just kind of a shorthand to quickly illustrate when I talk about Richie Grant without going into deep detail, he fits on this end of the spectrum in terms of his coverage or his tackling or whatever the case may be. So with that being established, let's jump into what I think is Richie Grant's biggest strength, which is kind of his versatility. And I think that's going to make him a very good fit in this Dean Pease defense, based off of at least my understanding of how Pease typically uses the free safety from watching how past safeties have shined in the system. And what Pease wants is versatility. He wants guys that can play in a variety of different coverages, can play deep, can play intermediate, can cover the slot, line up in the box versus the run, blitz, etc. And because Dean Pease disguises so much of his coverages and is willing to dial up blitzes, you kind of need those safeties to be capable of doing multiple things. And Richie Grant played in a system at Central Florida that asked him to do a lot of different things, and many of the same things that I imagine Dean Pease will be asking him to do here in Atlanta. He played all over the place. He can play in any coverage shell, whether you're talking about the cover 1, cover 2, cover 3, cover 4, or / quarters coverage that you primarily see. Those are the 4 main coverage shells that you will see consistently in the NFL level. I don't know if he's a safety that's tailor-made for one particular coverage, although we'll get into some of the reasons for that later. But if I was leaning towards the ideal coverage that I would like to see Richie Grant play, at least mostly in the NFL, it would probably be those middle of the field open coverages, the cover 2 or the quarters coverage. which is fine because I think that's the direction that the league seemingly is going in, collectively moving away from that middle of the field close coverages, the cover 1 to cover 3 that has been popularized by the Seattle Seahawks for the last 7 or 8 years. And of course, the Falcons ran primarily under Dan Quinn. So we'll definitely get into this later, but I think a lot of it has to do with the neck up abilities that Richie Grant has that can make him more of the quarterback of the secondary. That means his growth potential is very high, playing more of those middle of the field open coverages where it's less about having this elite range that you're kind of looking for, particularly in that single high safety in the cover 1 or cover 3, where you're looking for a little bit more physical skills and whatnot in that regard. So we'll get into more of where Grant is in some of these areas. We'll talk about that versatility, how he checks each box or maybe doesn't check all of the boxes in certain areas in terms of his versatility to play in the DMP system as we continue today's Locked On Falcons podcast. But before we get there, guys, I do have to plug not only the NHL side of the Locked On Podcast Network, but the NBA side of the Locked On Podcast Network. This weekend, the NHL started their playoffs. We're only a couple of days away for the NBA. So find your favorite team's daily podcast here on the Locked On Podcast Network, whether you're a hockey fan or basketball fan. Of course, you can check out the Atlanta Hawks daily podcast on the Locked On Hawks podcast hosted by Brad Rowland. And you can find every Locked On Podcast Network podcast on the Odyssey app or wherever you get your podcasts. So Falcon fans, you should listen up. Nugenix is the #1 selling free testosterone booster at GNC and is offering a complimentary bottle to all football fans in America. To get your complimentary bottle of Nugenix Total T, all you got to do is text DRAFT to 231231. This unique man boosting formula is powered by Testofen, which helps boost free testosterone and total testosterone levels and increases energy and lean muscle mass. If you're over 40 or like me approaching 40, don't let age get in the way. Get your edge back with Nugenix. Plus now, if you text now, they'll include a bottle of Nugenix Thermo, their most powerful fat incinerator ever, and it has key ingredients that will help you get back into shape, and you can get that absolutely free. All you got to do is text DRAFT to 231231. That's DRAFT, D-R-A-F-T, to 231231. Message and data rates may apply. Now, during this day and age, investing can be complicated, but whether you're a beginner or you've been investing for years, Wealthfront makes it easy. They have the right tools for every portfolio. Wealthfront can create a portfolio of globally diversified, low-cost index funds personalized just for you in just minutes. No manual trades, no picking stocks, no watching the stock market every day. They automatically handle all the investing based on the preferences that you control. Wealthfront is trusted with over $20 billion of assets, and you can get your first $5,000 managed for free by going to wealthfront.com/lockedonnfl. Grow your wealth the easy way and let Wealthfront do the work for you. To get your first $5,000 managed for free for life, go to wealthfront.com/lockedonnfl. That's wealthfront.com/lockedonnfl. To start growing your savings, go to wealthfront.com/lockedonnfl and get started today. So obviously the safety role is primarily a role where they provide deep help for the defense. And like I said, Grant can play in any coverage shell that you want, providing that deep help. And again, I think he'll be better in those middle field open coverages, the cover 2, the quarters, cover 4, because I don't think he necessarily has the ideal range of playing that single high post safety that you see in the cover 1 or in the cover 3. You know, he can do it. You'll probably watch some of his highlights showing that range in that regard. But the more you watch, the more you see him not necessarily having the elite coverage instincts or the elite range to be a high level player in that defense. If he was stuck in a cover 1 or cover 3 scheme, to me, he'd be more like that Ricardo Allen type of player. He's more Ricardo Allen in that sense, that if he went to a scheme that was asked to play in that single high role a lot more exclusively, which again, for the record, I don't believe the Falcons will operate such a scheme. He's more a guy that will do his job and hit singles and doubles versus the home runs that you saw from a guy like DeMonte Casey. For the last 7-8 years, people have been looking for the next Earl Thomas to be that, home run hitter. Earl Thomas is the Barry Bonds of single high free safeties, I guess you could say, the Hank Aaron, for a more local reference, in terms of what he can do. And, a lot of people have been looking for that player these last 7-8 years. And a lot of players in that time have been hyped to be the next Earl Thomas. You heard a lot about Malik Hooker this offseason as a potential Falcons free agent target. He was one of those guys once upon a time that was hyped to be one of those guys, but in my opinion, over the last 7-8 years, despite there's, a dozen or more guys that have been hyped to be, he's the next Earl Thomas. I think the only one that's come close to living up to that hype is Justin Simmons with the Denver Broncos. And that's part of the reason why I tended to cut Ricardo Allen a little bit more slack than some people were, because I think a lot of people were sort of critical of his limited playmaking skills, his limitations as a post safety. But because in my eyes, there weren't that many safeties that were capable of doing the things that people wanted Ricardo Allen to do and be, it was one of those things where like those guys just don't exist that much. And so I don't feel like knocking a player because he's not Earl Thomas when it's like nobody is kind of the point. So I think with Richie Grant, he would not be the exception. He would not be the next Earl Thomas. He would not be the next Justin Simmons in that regard if he was asked to play that role. You look at his 10 interceptions that he had over his career at UCF, and, a large number of those plays did come from him operating as that single high post safety. But the vast majority of those were kind of overthrows, deflections, underthrows. If a quarterback stared down his read and then threw a bad ball that hung up in the air a bit too long, Richie Grant was able to go and make that play, and he did that a number of times in college. But I don't think he'll have nearly as much success doing that in the pros for obvious reasons, simply because quarterback play will be significantly better than what he saw in the college ranks. And that gets me to sort of my next point, which, people will sort of see his stat line in terms of his interceptions and think, he's this big time ball hawking playmaker in terms of his coverage potential. And I would probably pump the brakes a little bit somewhat on that. He did have 6 interceptions as a sophomore, but then he only had 1 as a junior and 3 this past year. And my expectation for what he'll be in the pros in terms of his production, in terms of creating those takeaways, is probably he'll be closer to what he was as a junior and senior than what he was as a sophomore. A guy that can get you 2 or 3 interceptions. If he did wind up having a season where he did have 5 or 6 interceptions, I'd wager it would probably be likely due to the fact that the Falcons cornerback play was significantly better and those guys were able to break up passes and that led to deflections. And then he would sort of capitalize on that and being a guy that can be in a good position to make those plays and be opportunistic in that regard. But I don't think you would expect him to sort of repeat those sort of 5 or 6 interception stat lines year after year. I think his awareness is good, going back to being in a good position. But because of that lack of elite range, he seemed to be much more effective playing closer to the line of scrimmage. His ability to diagnose plays was really good, and he showcased that more in the sort of underneath and intermediate zones than when he was asked to play deep, because in those underneath and intermediate zones, he's asked to cover less ground, and he's able to, given his speed, do that more effectively. And, that comes with him sniffing out screens and swing pass, and he did that a number of times. Now, there was a couple of times where he would try to do that and kind of bite on motion or have his eyes stuck in the backfield, which would lead to a blown coverage or two. So he does have a little bit of a gambling streak within him. And I think that's generally a good thing to have in a safety, as long as it's not out of control. And I felt like Grant kept that in check. So I'm not too worried about it. But, there were a couple of plays that he left on the field where he got caught out of position. I kind of joked on Twitter earlier this week that Richie Grant was a box safety, just kind of to troll people and see how they would react to it. But I did honestly think some of his better tape was when he was asked to play closer to the line of scrimmage and be more of that force player as the 7th or 8th defender in the box. And when it came to filling run gaps and showing the discipline that you want there, I thought he was really good in that regard. So I do think that is a strength. But he's not a guy that's going to take on blockers at the point of attack, at least when it comes to offensive linemen and tight ends. But he'll come downhill. He'll make the wrap tackle in the hole. And on his tackling, I think he improved across his career. He was able to cut down on the missed tackles. Pro Football Focus charted him with only 6 missed tackles in 2020 after 13 in 2019 and 14 in 2018. So his technique in terms of tackling is generally good. He generally takes good angles to the ball. He'll wrap up their legs of a ball carrier. He's not a big guy, but he'll run the alley. He'll deliver the hit. He'll chop the legs coming out there as a missile. and deliver some hits, particularly the quarterbacks and receivers more so than running backs, because, running backs can kind of give it as good as they get, and, quarterbacks and wide receivers typically don't. So, I won't say he's making business decisions, but let's say he's a smart businessman where he knows who he's going to lower the boom on versus who he's not going to lower the boom on. And I thought he did a good job, tackling with good technique and leading with the shoulder and whatnot, and not leading with the head or anything to the degree where you would worry about those being a problem with penalties at the next level or in college level. I think with his tackling, given the increased level of competition that he'll see, especially at running back and tight end, it probably will lead to him missing more tackles in the pros than he did, especially this last year at UCF. I don't think he'll be a liability in that regard, but on the KZ Allen spectrum, he's probably somewhere in the middle, more reliable tackler than Casey, but probably not as reliable as Allen was, and we saw Ricardo Allen deliver some hits over the years. And I think Grant can be similar in that regard. But obviously it would pale in comparison to someone like Keanu Neal in terms of that having that hit stick. As a blitzer, I thought Richie Grant was effective. But whenever he was forced or asked to beat a blocker, whether it was an offensive lineman or a running back stepping up to fill in pass protection, he was mostly stonewalled in those regards. So I think in terms of my expectation for how effective a blitzer he'll be in the NFL, it'll purely be a product of how good his defensive coordinator is at scheming him ways to come free, coming from, the slot or coming from that second or third level. And obviously that's something that Dean Pease prides himself on being able to do. So we could see him be an effective blitzer in that regard at the next level, but it won't be because of how great a blitzer he is. It's more going to be a byproduct of scheme and whatnot. So I really do think he can do all the things that you really want for him to do in this scheme. And we'll talk a little bit more about his upside as well as one other aspect of what he'll be asked to do in the scheme as we wrap up today's episode. That will be talking about his ability to cover the slot, and that will allow us to talk a little bit more about the players that he compares to when we talk about his eye level, his ceiling, his floor being where his NFL career is going to start, his ceiling being sort of the max potential he has, and the eye level being sort of halfway in between that point, which is likely going to be the player that he winds up being. And we'll have 3 different NFL players that we will compare him to as we wrap up today's scouting report of Richie Grant on Locked On Falcons. But before we get there, guys, you know that I have you covered on all things Falcons. But what about the rest of sports? Well, host Peter Bukowski has you covered there with the Locked On Today podcast. It's all the sports news that you need every morning in under 20 minutes. And of course, this time of year is a great time to be checking out all the different sports that are going on around the nation and around the world. And you can find all of that on the Locked On Today podcast. You can subscribe to it on the Odyssey app or wherever you get your podcasts. So BetOnline is the fastest and easiest way to bet on all your sports action. BetOnline gives you all the latest news, odds, and info for all your sporting needs, including MLB, NBA, NHL, and all your UFC and MMA action. There's nothing quite like the month of May to get started at BetOnline. This weekend was an action-packed weekend. NHL playoffs began. You had UFC action. You had the second leg of the Triple Crown and the Preakness as well. NBA playoffs are coming up. The French Open is coming up. And, of course, baseball season is still in full swing, and you can track all that action at BetOnline. And it's not just sports. BetOnline even covers awards, TV shows, and reality TV. You can get real-time updated odds and props on almost anything you can imagine at BetOnline. Just head over there or use your mobile device to sign up today at BetOnline.ag. Use the promo code LOCKEDON to receive a 50% welcome bonus on your first deposit. Again, that's promo code LOCKEDON for a 50% welcome bonus, meaning that if you deposit $100, you get $50 in free money to play with by using that promo code LOCKEDON. BetOnline, your online sportsbook experts. So when we're talking about Richie Grant's floor, sort of where his starting point is in the NFL, if they had to play a game tomorrow, this is what I expect Richie Grant to be. I was very tempted to go with the familiar example in DeMonte Casey, but I ultimately decided on Marcus Gilchrist. For those that don't know Gilchrist, he was a player that I actually was surprised to discover was still in the league last year, played with the Ravens last year, but is a former Clemson cornerback that was drafted in round 2 in 2011. I remember Gilchrist did a deep dive going back to my old scouting reports because I did a lot of work in that 2011 draft, a decade ago. And I had like a 6-round grade on Marcus Gilchrist. And so when he got drafted in round 2, I think 50th overall by the Chargers, I remember being shocked at the time. Like, what? Like, this guy's a zone cover corner that might be a decent backup, but doesn't have necessarily the man cover skills. And the Chargers found that out relatively soon. He spent 2 relatively underwhelming seasons as the Chargers nickel corner before they wound up moving him to safety. And he made a home there as a functional starter for the next 9 seasons, including last year. As a safety, Gilchrist is more in that Ricardo Allen boat, one of those quote unquote do your job guys, but I think he's probably a poor man's version of Ricardo Allen. Despite starting 6 seasons as a safety, Gilchrist has never really been a starter on a good defense outside of 1 year, in that first year in Todd Bowles with New York in 2015, when the Jets went out that offseason, spent a bunch of money to revamp their secondary by signing Gilchrist, Buster Screen. They brought back Darrell Revis and Antonio Cromartie. But my recollection is that defense was mostly good, not because of their secondary, but because of their front 4. That was also the last year that Mo Wilkerson played at a really high level before he got paid the following year and then fell apart. Snacks Harrison also left the following year in 2016 to go to the Giants. Sheldon Richardson's off-field stuff sort of came to a head the following year as well. And 2015 also was Leonard Williams' rookie season. So like my recollection was that Jets defense was good, not because of how good their secondary was, but how good their front was, as opposed to, Gilchrist being an integral part of that. And so to me, the comp with Richie Grant is like day one, he can come in and be a decent starter on a bad defense like Gilchrist was throughout most of his career, but not somebody you're going to write home about, which is why Gilchrist has since been a journeyman since leaving the Chargers. He's been on 6 different teams since 2015. So Grant's floor to me is a guy that's a serviceable starter on a rookie contract, but 4 years from now, when it's time to pay him, he's probably going to be a guy that the Falcons let walk, and then he bounces around the league for a couple of years starting on teams that for the most part don't have better options. And that's not necessarily great, but remember, that's what I think he is going to be day one. Most players, when we're talking about this, these things will unfold later on when we do later scouting reports, most of these guys' floors are going to be backups and special teamers. I'm comparing him to a guy that's a 6-year starter, and saying that he can be an effective player, as that day one that another guy has been, over 6 years or whatever the case may be. So keep that in mind. As for Grant's ceiling, Rodney McLeod was the player I settled on. I was tempted to go with Devin McCourty because I think in terms of his usage, Dean Pease will kind of try to utilize Richie Grant in the same ways that Bill Belichick kind of utilizes Devin McCourty over the years and be that kind of guy that can do all of every different thing and be a high level safety. But, similar to McLeod, McCourty is one of those players that is not necessarily universally recognized as an elite safety at the forefront of people's mind. If I were to ask you, like, okay, name your top 5 or top 10 safeties in the league, I doubt very few of you would name Rodney McLeod, and probably more might name Devin McCourty, but he probably is more the guy that, like, if I said, oh, Devin McCourty, and you're like, oh yeah, Devin McCourty is one of the better safeties in the league, but he's not at the forefront of your mind. And, getting to McLeod, at his peak during his days in LA and Philadelphia now, he was a high level starter, right? You could argue that he was legitimately a top 10 safety in the league at his peak, but rarely got kind of recognition for that. And unlike Gilchrist, McLeod, and McCourty as well, are guys that are important and key starters on good defenses. McLeod has started 7 years in the NFL, minus 1 or 2 years that he's missed primarily due to injuries. And 5 of those years, he's been on a team that was a top 10 defense according to Football Outsiders DVOA. And it's not to sit here and say that McLeod single-handedly is responsible for those defenses being top 10. But as I've said on the podcast in previous times, and I'm sure you've also heard other people opine over the last couple of years, especially given the inconsistency of the Falcons safety play, is it's hard to find good defenses that don't have high-level safety play. And I think that means that, McLeod has been a significant part of his respective teams in LA and Philadelphia's success on defense. And so ultimately, I kind of went with McLeod over McCourty because, like Gilchrist, McCourty entered the NFL as a corner before being moved to safety. And I think that now gives a great opportunity to talk about Richie Grant's ability to line up as a slot corner. And I think, as I said, Grant can do that effectively. He was effective in college when he was asked to do that, but I don't think that's going to be necessarily his calling card in pros. According to Pro Football Focus, Rodney McLeod has lined up in the slot about 10% of his snaps across his career. That's actually a higher percentage than McCourty, who's only been at like 9% since he was moved to safety full time. But obviously McCourty started out his career as an outside corner in the first 3 years of his NFL career before being moved to safety permanently. And I would imagine that if he was asked to cover the slot a lot more, he'd probably be a lot more effective doing it than where he's currently asked to do. As a point of reference, you compare these numbers to Ricardo Allen, who about 8% of his snaps across the last 6 years have been as a slot guy, but from 2017 to 2018, that peaked around 11%. So like, that's kind of where I kind of see Grant falling in that 10, 11%, which effectively amounts to about 5 or 6 snaps a game, on par, and I think Grant has room to grow in terms of his ability to get better in the slot. Watching his one-on-ones at the Senior Bowl, he gave up one of the higher percentages of completions to wide receivers among the safeties there. I think about 71% based off of Pro Football Focus's charting of the one-on-one snaps. But what's also notable is that he had one of the higher percentage of reps that he won the rep, right? So what that means is like he's doing a good job to prevent a completion as opposed to just kind of being there and for whatever reason the receiver didn't catch the ball, either a bad throw or a drop or whatever the case may be. So I think that translates to me at least that there is some baseline skill that he has where there's room to grow in terms of being a more effective slot cover guy. But I don't know if he's ever going to have the high-end traits where you're going to ask him to go up on a regular basis against some of the high-level slot receivers that he's going to face in the NFL. You look at in the division, those are guys like Michael Thomas, Chris Godwin stand out in that regard. So similar to what we saw with Ricardo Allen and Rodney McLeod, for a half dozen snaps a game, he'll do more than an adequate job in that regard. But I don't think he's going to be a guy like Honey Badger is, or CJ Gardner-Johnson, or Budda Baker, Malcolm Jenkins, or even Micah Hyde, guys that have been somewhat known for being more as a slot guy, as a calling card of what they can do. So getting back to what Rodney McLeod is, you look at some of his stat lines, you see 14 interceptions across 7 seasons as a starter. And again, that's kind of what I'm expecting from Richie Grant. The biggest knock to me on McLeod is kind of his tackling is inconsistent, which again, I think Grant could be better in that regard, but it might be an issue similar to what you see with McLeod that sort of springs up and probably is the main reason that prevents him from being considered one of the premier safeties, one of the top 5-10 safeties at a consistent level. And certainly probably contributes to why he doesn't grade as highly as some of those top 5 to 10 safeties, at least in Pro Football Focus. So the thing that McLeod is, he's a very smart, instinctual, free safety. He can play in any different coverage. He can play some of that single high. He can play some of that split safety stuff, that middle of field open stuff. And he's been an integral part of some very good defenses in LA and Philadelphia. And I think Grant has that same type of potential. I think he too, like McLeod, can be that sort of quarterback of the secondary, because everything I've ever heard about Richie Grant says that he checks those boxes in terms of character and leadership and approach to the game and being considered by his secondary coach, Willie Martinez. I heard an episode of the Journey to the Draft podcast with Fran Duffy where he interviewed him, and he was basically waxing poetic about how Richie was, very professional in his approach to the game. And so I see those things, that baseline, that high character stuff being a baseline in which you can grow, and that will allow him, similar to McLeod, to potentially reach his ceiling, even though you don't necessarily look at the film and say, oh, this guy's one of the great specimens as a safety. So, like McLeod, I don't think Grant's going to be the biggest, fastest, or strongest guy, but may wind up being one of the smarter, if not smartest, in the league. And we'll just hope for the future, the Falcons will wind up having defenses as good as what we've seen from the Rams and Eagles over this last decade. And I think if they do wind up developing that, then certainly Richie Grant will be an integral part of that. Even if, like McLeod, he never becomes necessarily a household name. But I think for people that study the position, Rodney McLeod is considered one of the top safeties in the league. So that leaves us what is Richie Grant's eye level? What is that player that's sort of halfway between that if we're putting odds on it, it's not necessarily a player will should hopefully exceed his floor, but probably may not reach his ceiling. So what are the player that's the odds are saying are going to be closer to what he actually is? And I was tempted to go with a familiar example in Ricardo Allen, but I felt like that was probably a little lazy. So ultimately I went with Jimmy Ward. Now, Jimmy Ward is a little bit more of the slot specialist that I spoke in terms of earlier Grant not being. Ward has been a solid pro. The biggest knock on Jimmy Ward has been durability. He has not been able to stay healthy. He's only played 16 games one time in his 7 years in the NFL, and he's missed an average of 5 games per year due to various injuries. Ward entered the league primarily playing as a slot corner as a former first-round pick with the 49ers in 2014. But once Shanahan arrived, they moved him to safety, and, I think about 16% of his snaps have come in the slot. So a little bit more than the other guys that we've been talking about. But he had his best year in 2019. We talked about this a little bit before, and he was kind of an underrated part of that defense, in my opinion, that 2019 49ers defense that went to the Super Bowl. We talked about earlier the Jets being good in that 1 year under Bowles because of their front four, and I felt like the 49ers during that run to the Super Bowl, the front got all the publicity, but I think the secondary was a very underrated element of their success that year, with Richard Sherman and K'Wan Williams and Jimmy Ward being part of that. And that was one of the few years that Ward was relatively healthy. He played 13 games in 2019 after missing a combined 21 the 3 previous years. And I think having Jimmy Ward be more of that stable force in the secondary was a critical part of their success that year. But you're probably not going to look at the 49ers defense and immediately look and say, oh, Jimmy Ward's one of their top players. But I think he's a fairly solid contributor to those defenses, even if he's not a big time playmaker. Only 2 career interceptions and none since being a full time safety. Ward just kind of seems halfway between Gilchrist and McLeod to me, as a guy that can be somewhat a key starter on a good defense, but most of the time he's just going to be a solid guy. There's nothing to write home about. Ward is in that sort of Ricardo Allen tier of safety, which is an above average to good starter. Both guys wound up earning second contracts with their respective teams. But there's always going to kind of be a part at the back of your mind, like, can we do better than this? And you're probably like, yeah, we probably could, but the level of investment that you would have to have probably like a top 20 pick in order to get a clear upgrade over what guys like Jimmy Ward and Ricardo Allen bring to the table, you probably ultimately will decide, like, it's better for us to actually invest that type of capital, that type of investment in a position that we're weak at, as opposed to investing it at a position that we're already relatively solid at. It's like is it worth it to go from a 6 to an 8 versus a 4 to an 8? You know what I'm saying? So, when it comes to this stuff, like, I know I don't always paint the rosiest portraits of players and their upsides and their ceilings from these various scouting reports that I do, but based off all the things I've heard people say about Richie Grant and at least my evaluation of him, I do feel fairly optimistic that with this new coaching staff in place, that there is a much higher probability that he, from a development standpoint, will wind up reaching a ceiling. The same goes for guys like Kyle Pitts. So I have a lot more optimism for these guys in particular. I won't necessarily know. We'll find out if I have the same level of optimism for the subsequent 7 players that we drafted this year, but time will tell on that. But I think there's absolutely a reason, why, guys like Pitts obviously was considered the best player at his position, and Grant, to a lesser extent, at least some people thought he was the best player in his position. And I think that gives those guys potential, a leg up to sort of reach their ceilings at the next level. There's a reason why those guys are considered high level players. And it's not just simply because they're great athletes. So I feel optimistic about that. So there's my Richie Grant scouting report, guys. A guy that I think can be the quarterback of the secondary, a guy that I think can be a high level safety, but just may not be a household name in terms of when people rattle off the best safeties in the league, but be more of that Rodney McLeod type that can be an integral part of a really good defense. And hopefully the Falcons will grow a really good defense in the time over the next couple of years. But we'll see. So there you guys have it. We have more to come on Richie Grant on tomorrow's episode, where I will be joined by a guest to give his insights into Richie Grant, as well as probably some of these other players in the Falcons draft class. And don't know what else we're going to do this week. Hopefully we'll get to Jalen Mayfield by the end of the week. So Friday, hopefully we'll have a scouting report on Jalen Mayfield if all things go according to plan. But other than that, we'll figure out some other stuff to talk about later this week. And while I figure out those things out on Locked On Falcons, I do want to remind you guys to check out the Locked On Today podcast, where they cover all of sports. They get everything you need every morning in under 20 minutes. Check out the Locked On Today podcast hosted by Peter Bukowski on the Odyssey app or wherever you get your podcast. Appreciate it, guys. If you want to provide me feedback on anything I talked about on today's episode or anything you want me to talk about on future episodes, we'll probably do a Q&A in the middle of the week. That's usually what happens when I don't have necessarily strong plans on stuff to talk about. Maybe we'll get some reactions to the rookie mini camp and whatnot as well. So that could potentially be on deck. So keep that in tune. But, if you want to provide feedback on things that you want me to talk about on future episodes, of course, you can hit me up on Twitter at Locked On Falcons, on Facebook at Locked On Falcons, or you can send an email to lockedonfalcons@mail.com. Appreciate it, guys. Until then.